So welcome everyone to Accessible Word Documents. This will be recorded and I will send out the links. So if you have any questions, feel free to respond to that email once it gets sent out. I will try to have that sent out by the end of the week here. So we're going to start off with some general guidelines. These are going to be applicable across the spectrum, whether you're working with Word or an HTML page or something like a PowerPoint, something like that. We're going to start off with choice of font. One of the things here is to look at your choice of kind of decorative fonts. We're looking at serif versus sans serif. And if you compare the word serif on the slide to the word sans serif, you can kind of see the difference. This is actually Times New Roman and I believe Calibri as the comparison here. So serif font's going to have those extra fiddly bits. It just makes it a little harder to read for anyone with a brain-based disability, especially dyslexia. Also look at your font size. A lot of HTML especially will have the ability to have responsive font sizes, but when you're working with a Word document, you're giving the user the option to increase the font size if they're enable editing after they've downloaded it. But when you're creating the document, you can just look at that font size and just go ahead and make it accessible. You're looking at nothing smaller than, say, 11 or 10 for your normal size of paragraphs. Also, when you're using italics or underlining for emphasis, you want to use it sparingly. You don't want to have entire paragraphs that are italicized or excessive underlining, especially as underlining has become kind of a de facto usage for links. So if someone is kind of scanning through a document, they may assume that you've underlined something and meant to link it, and that's not properly linked. Also, anything with all caps is going to be hard to read as well, and at least in internet terms, it kind of feels like you're being shouted at. So we're also looking at color contrast and use of color. This is one of those things that's going to be repeated throughout a lot of these, is that color is something that we want to use because it makes something more interesting, more vibrant, but it's also somewhere where we can really mess up with what we're presenting. An accessible color ratio is 4.5 to 1. And this slide gives an example of the WebAIM contrast checker. So you can actually use an eyedropper tool to compare the background and foreground colors of font or an image, something like that. So this has shown this very bright yellow and mustardy color. That is only a contrast of 1.64 to 1. So you can see on that normal text especially, it's very hard to read. Also, if you're going to use color, be aware of using color as the sole source of information. If you're, say, turning a word red as an indication that it is not allowed or highlighting something in red, make sure that you have enough information that if someone cannot see this color, they are not missing out on the information. So you can combine that with text or shapes. Say if you have like a green check mark or a red X, just want to make sure that you're keeping that in mind for anyone who is low vision or colorblind. And then looking at the formatting of your documents. First off, it's tables. Tables are notoriously difficult for screen readers, and a lot of times we tend to use tables for space arrangement instead of actually something that needs to be presented as data, things like that. So the first question is always, does this need to be a table? Are you presenting data or are you just using it to arrange space? If it does need to be a table and you want it to be a table, make sure you're specifying your table headers. So this is information at the top of each column that says what this table is doing. That's going to be very helpful for screen readers. As you're creating your document, make sure there's adequate spacing between each character in a word, each line or each word itself, each line, and each paragraph. You want to make sure you have adequate spacing so that it's easy to read and it's not clumped together. That's, again, is going to help with brain-based disabilities and anyone who's low vision. Looking at ordered and unordered lists, this is more of an HTML term. This is going to be numbered and bulleted list. Numbered lists are ordered, bulleted lists are unordered. If you're using a list, which can actually be really great for screen readers because it's going to read it in order, make sure you're not breaking up that list by putting a paragraph in the middle. That's going to confuse the order sometimes. You'll notice that maybe you have to like fiddle with the numbers to make it right. So if you're going to have a list, don't break it up with other information. Kind of have the list, and if you need to explain more, do so, but outside of the context of the list. And if you're using any images, make sure that you're using adequate alt text. We've talked about alt text before. We will talk about it again. I'm going to kind of just glaze over it today. But basically, you need to describe what the image is. If it has any text in the image, you need to represent that text or a paraphrased version of that text so that that information is not being missed by anyone who cannot actually see it. And just a caveat that if you use Word, you'll often, when you go to edit the alt text, see that it's attempted with generative AI to guess what it is this image is. It is often frequently and hilariously wrong. So definitely don't trust what it's trying to say. When you are adding links to a document that will be displayed online, make sure that your link text is meaningful. You don't want to just say click here and link here. If someone with a screen reader is parsing through a document and just tabbing through all the links, all they're going to hear is the word here and then the link read out loud. So if instead of click here, something like register for this program, something along those lines where you're getting like proper nouns or verb phrases. And be aware that pasting can be dangerous. If you are pasting in something, especially into Word, there's all sorts of hidden code that might be pasted with it. That's why if you right click and paste, you're going to get like merge with formatting or just pasting the link text and then you can format it individually. If you ever paste in, say, a content management system or a website, you can see that there's some extra code, especially if you're pasting from like SharePoint. There's all sorts of junk code that ends up pasted in there that you're not aware of. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to look at this picture for a moment. And feel free to unmute or type in the chat. I want to know, based on what we just discussed, what's wrong with this picture? This is a document that I created for our Leia program, which was our library of ebooks and audiobooks. I purposefully messed this up so that this is no longer accessible. And actually, there is one issue that turns out I realized in doing this that is not accessible and we should stop doing that. So seeing Ellen saying spacing in the first paragraph, correct. Font is too fancily not easily read in the title, yes. I have been excessive with my underlining and italics. Correct, the contrast is not sufficient on the headings. I think we've got, yep, using a table. That's the one that I realized as I was doing this, that we have that in the document as it is formed. So going forward, I will need to take out my table and make that more accessible. I think there is the only other thing, in addition to the title font being too fancy and not easily read, it's also cramped. That is I think it's a compressed font because you can choose the different fonts that you're when you have that big drop down list. So yes, that is all of the issues in this document. And later on, you're going to see an example of what this document actually looks like in a shortened form. So when we're looking at word-specific accessibility, I'm going to look at a couple things here. And first is the accessibility assistant. This is a little bit different on desktop versus web, so we're going to see some of those differences in just a minute. So what this does is it's actually going to check your document as you type. It's looking for common errors. You can see this one. This is actually the accessibility assistant for the document that you just saw. Hard to read text contrasts. It's picking up those headings. Missing alt text, I had shoved an image down in the bottom that you didn't see on the screen and just left it. Actually, I stripped out the alt text because it had been a stock image. Missing table header on that little fragment of a table. You can see the other things here are if you are using a table, if you merge or split cells, that gets really confusing for a screen reader. So if you can avoid doing that and say use headings and separate tables instead of trying to shove everything in one table and merge across, that's going to be a lot easier for reading. So document structure, we had headings, so it didn't see any errors there. And one of the other things it looks for is restricted access. If you've got any sort of password on a document where if you're sending it out to people that they might not be able to access it. And this is beyond the basic sharing, I believe, that OneDrive or SharePoint has enabled. It's not going to pick up that issue. It's going to pick up additional passwords or protection that you've added to the document. So when you're looking at this, this is going to be found not only in the bottom status bar where there's a little accessibility icon and then it'll say investigate or good to go. You can also go to the review toolbar in Word and find it there and check accessibility. Now, some of these things are going to require manual checking. So just because you have alt text doesn't mean that it's the correct alt text. Just because you have headings in the document doesn't mean that they're the correct order. You might be missing a step, or you might have used the wrong heading level when you're doing your document. When we're looking at the web version, we're looking at a little bit different view here. It's got issues, warnings, tips. I couldn't get it to trigger the tips or that last icon there. However, this is not checking as you type. This is something you have to trigger manually. So you can see in the screenshot of the accessibility wizard here, it shows you when that you last rechecked. At the bottom, it's giving an error that the results are no longer current. So it does prompt you to recheck if you've added anything to the document in the meantime. And again, you're having to do that manual rechecking here with alt text, with heading levels, anything that it's not quite smart enough to know to check those things. And this is found in the review toolbar. You don't have that handy bottom bar like you do in the desktop version, but it is definitely still there. So then when we're looking at headings and organization, this is that document as it was presented. You can see that I've collapsed the headings. This is something you can only unfortunately do in the desktop version if you want to see that outline. Each level of heading will let you collapse down so that you can see what it looks like with just those headings. One of the most important things is to use the headings in the logical order. This is not only going to help the reader focus where the sections and subsections of your document are, it's really going to help anyone with a screen reader know the hierarchy of that information. So that's again why it's important not to skip any heading levels. This document, if you're used to using HTML for things, you're used to having like H1 being your top level heading, your title of the document. For Word, that's actually the title. So you want to make sure that you're not accidentally skipping that as well. And then you've got your heading 1, and you can go down heading 2, heading 3. I believe Word has presets for up through heading level 6 or 8, which I don't think most people need that many, but it's nice to at least make sure you're going through and having those top level headings. And I'm going to say this so many times with emphasis, please don't use headings as styles ever. It's so easy to do it. It's so easy to set up a way that, you like the text to look and you want to pull out a quote or something like that. It's going to make your document inaccessible because a screen reader is going to pull that out and say, this is a heading, this is the beginning of new information, when all you've really done is made it so that it's something that's fancier. Much more common issue in web pages than in Word, but wanted to mention it because we're talking about headings here. One more thing with headings is to use simpler language. So you can see in this example, we've got background, purpose, procedures, reporting. These are all really short headings because a screen reader, if you're just going through the list there, is going to be reading all of these out. The longer you make that heading, the more confusing it could be for your user. And it also really helps to kind of hone in on what it is that this section is about. So obviously sometimes it's going to need to be longer, need to be more descriptive, but the more concise that you can make these headings, the better. Also looking at headers and footers. So if you're not familiar, headers and footers are the sections at the top and bottom of a Word document. You have to specifically open up the editor to edit these sections. When you use these sections, if you use these sections, you want to make sure this is non-essential information only. Many screen readers are going to be set to ignore headers and footers, especially if you, say, put a letterhead in this section. The screen reader may not see it, and if you've used that as an image, any alt text may not be picked up by the screen reader as well. If you are going to use headers and footers, make sure that if you're using page numbers, use the page number tool instead of typing the numbers manually. Again, if this gets picked up by a screen reader, it's going to be confusing for the user because the screen reader software can tell the difference between that page number tool and something that you've manually typed in. To really be cognizant of why you're using a certain format, what you're doing with it, and how the user may perceive it. One of the things that you can do with this in desktop is there's a read aloud button in the review toolbar on the desktop version. So what this does, if you put your cursor at the beginning of the document, it will start reading in that kind of Microsoft Sam voice what it's actually seeing. So that can be helpful if you've used kind of any sort of emojis or fancy things in your document. It will tell you what it sees it as. If you are using the web version, you can do the same thing with narrator or voiceover if you're using a Apple product. It's just a little bit harder to get set up. It has an additional step to get there. Now, if you've got something where you know exactly what your document wants, you want your document to look like, you want all of your documents to be similar, you can set up a template. This is primarily something you want to do on the desktop version. We'll talk about the web version in just a minute, but it's a little bit harder to do with that. So you create your document, you add any formatting or styles or any other elements that you want to your document. So this is if you want your heading to be a certain color, certain size, certain font, you set all of that up. Save your document as a .x file. So we're used to seeing docx, docx. This is a dotx. This is a template file, and it's going to default to a certain place. Make note of that file location, and then after you've saved it, make sure you go into your settings, because for a lot of people, their default personal templates location is not defined in Word. So you might create this great template, you want to share it out to people, and they may try to open Word and try to access it, and it's not showing up. It's generally because this setting is blank. So make sure you've got that set. It's under Options and Save. You can just basically from File Explorer, I'm assuming Microsoft here, um, from that file location, you can just copy it from File Explorer, paste it into that setting, and then it'll start finding your custom template files. And then to actually create a document from this template, you're going to New, and you see you've got these headings of Office and Personal. You want to tab over to Personal. Office is going to give you the pre-created Office ones that are, say, calendars or resumes, things like that. If you tab over to Personal, that'll be anything in that custom templates folder. Now, unfortunately, if you are on the web, you cannot create these organically. There is a workaround though. If you create the document as a base document, you can copy it in OneDrive. So this is a fragment of the right-click menu here. If you copy to same section or same folder in WordPoint or OneDrive or SharePoint, you can basically just use this document over and over again. You want to make sure though that you are making a copy, otherwise you are overwriting what you have created. So because this is a lot more difficult to do, it's best if you're only using it for structured and frequently used documents. So if you're doing something like meeting minutes where it has to be in a specific format before it can be posted, that's going to be the best option for this kind of thing. Word doesn't seem, or Microsoft doesn't seem to be interested in making the web version more robust because they want you to pay more money for the desktop version. So unfortunately, there are just some features, especially accessibility wise, that are not going to be available if you use the web version. So just going on to some learning opportunities and resources that we have coming up. And then once I get through this part, I do want to actually go into Word and show you some of these things. So with what we are doing here at MBLC, we are holding web accessibility office hours, first Fridays of the month at 11 a.m., third Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Actually, I think this is 3 p.m. or I've got something scheduled wrong. Because I remember my calendar looks different. I'll have to verify that, but it's definitely on the MBLC calendar. And then we're having these subject-specific trainings second Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Believe our next one will be semantic HTML, which Kate will be able to discuss if you have any questions about it. And we would like to start a cohort program. So what this is, and Kate, if you can put the link in the chat for me, it's an application. It's basically, we want to group together people who use the same content management system for your website. So if you have a group that all uses Civic Plus or a group that all uses WordPress, basically you can get together and discuss as a group if you have any issues with making something accessible. You can have a peer group to discuss these issues with. If, say, you are kind of stuck on how, maybe not how to do something, but how best, or you want to see how other people are doing it. And some other resources, I will have these links sent out with the recording, and I'm also sending the PowerPoint when I send it. Just the word accessibility guidance from Microsoft. It's very basic. It's got some extra stuff in there that, for example, call out paragraphs, which is just kind of a way to make something fancy, but I feel like is a little excessive. Linking the Department of Justice Title II ruling fact sheet, which is really what prompted all of this, was the change in the Department of Justice ruling to include municipalities and government entities in kind of this web accessibility requirements. So if you're not aware already, be aware of your compliance deadline. If you have a service population of 49,999 or less, you have until April 2027. If you serve 50,000 or more in your service population, you only have until April to get everything in your web presence accessible. And if you are part of a municipality, just wanted to make everyone aware of the ADA Improvement Grant Program. That actually can cover in their project section a web accessibility audit or any web accessibility work. They have specifically highlighted that as something that is part of what they do. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment as I get over to Word. While I am doing this, does anyone have any questions? Is something that has been made accessible in Word also accessible when converting into PDF? That depends. Um, it's best to make it accessible in Word and then export as an accessible PDF. So when you are downloading, I'm looking at WebWord right now, which is why I'm saying downloaded. But when you go to export, it should now take all of the things that you've added. I'm just going to double check when I try to do. I'm just looking at the Word options. I think when it says create Adobe PDF, it is going to create it as an accessible document, but it's definitely best to check once you get into PDFs. And we will be talking about PDFs eventually. It's just a lot more difficult when you are double checking that PDF to make it accessible, especially if you don't have anything to edit the PDF with. Go ahead and share my screen here. So I'm looking at Word online just because I know this one's going to have a little bit more of the issues with creating an accessible document. And again, feel free to keep putting those questions in chat as you come up with them. Just wanted to make sure that you're aware of some basic things in Word that maybe you haven't used before. So when you are looking for those headings, you've got your formatting here. You click the drop down, it's going to give you a lot of different options here that are be created by Word. Again, we've got title, we've got Word, or the web version only has heading 1 and 2. You can manage the default styles, the option here, but that's really only going to give you the option to reset to default. You can create new styles from something you've selected, and it does give you the option to see the whole list here. If you have something that's past that 1 and 2 here, it actually goes through heading level 9. And to find that accessibility checker here, we're going to go to to review and check accessibility. It's not going to find anything right now because we don't have anything in the document. So you've got errors, warnings, tips, and intelligent services. I assume this has something to do with AI. Like I said, when I was playing around with this, I couldn't get this to trigger, but I also don't really use the Copilot AI when I'm using Word. So because this is something that is on the web, I can't create it as a template, but I do still have a lot of the options for my paragraphs, got text alignment, your paragraph line spacing here. This is really something just to be aware of. if you're having trouble making something where it has to be a certain length, but you also want to make sure that it's properly spaced. Where you're looking at spacing between words is really where you're going to be looking at these font options. And again, Word will default to a sans serif font. Um, I don't know if like Modern Language Association format still requires Times New Roman, but it is something that you want to try to avoid the serif fonts in general if you can. And again, because we're on the web, it's going to give you oh, they do still. It shows you how long it's been since I've had to write a paper. I don't remember. Um, so again, you get all these really fancy font options, and just kind of be aware that while you have the tools in your toolbox, it doesn't mean that it's the best tool for what you're trying to do. So if you're going to use something like this, where it's a small or really kind of excessively flowy, just make sure you're making it large enough that it can also be read if you're doing something that's more decorative. I think other things with layout, just be aware if you're trying to use columns or tables, just be aware of the flow of your document. So again, we want to make sure that anyone who's using a screen reader or low vision is able to follow the flow of your document. So one of the things I was actually disappointed to realize was that in PowerPoint with color, there is a high contrast setting, and that is not included in Word. So unfortunately, again, you have this entire toolbox. You really have to be aware what is accessible compared to your background. If you're using a white page, it's really easy to just kind of keep it on automatic. But if you're going to be printing on colored paper, oh, I love that MLA says that Times New Roman is a boring font. It is a boring font. If you're going to be using colored paper, also be aware that even if your Word page says, oh, black on white, that's totally accessible. If you're using any sort of colored paper, you need to just be aware that once you've actually printed it, it may no longer be accessible. All right. Are there any questions? Anything that anyone would like to see? Um, with Word, any questions specific to Word functions? We really tried to make sure that the basic tech skills are included in this, just so that people are aware not only of like, hey, go make this thing in Word, but this is how you make this thing in Word. Um, so I know a lot of us, especially if we've been using Word or even back to things like WordPerfect, we have been doing this for a long time, and maybe we just didn't quite think of. I am very guilty of, instead of using headings, I just bold a line, and of course that's a heading. That's what I made, but that's not a heading. That's just a bolded word. So it's keeping in mind these kind of coding semantic background things as you create your document. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.